Go ahead, Rob and Sean.
All right. So real quick, just gonna introduce myself. Lieutenant Colonel Rob Prescott. I am an FA-57 Models and Simulations Officer, working at the Features and Concepts Command at Fort Eustis in Virginia. And uh, we asked to share what turned out to be apparently an award-winning tutorial on the applications of generative AI to wargaming that we worked on with my friend Sean Fraser and our another absent friend Aaron Wilcox. Pass over to you, Sean.
Yeah, just a quick introduction. Also a functional Area 57 or modeling and simulation officer. Been doing that for a while with a background in armor, combat arms. And then I'm currently stationed up at the Artificial Intelligence Integration Center up in Pittsburgh, but I'm TDY right now and in the Virginia area. Actually, I'm over at Quantico right now talking to the Marine Corps. So I'll kick it back to Rob to kick us off.
All right. And also to add, as a simulations officer, I'm also an armor officer background. So what you're about to see, hopefully will kind of shape this into a discussion. But you've got the kind of the viewpoints of practitioners more than like data scientists for this next little bit here. So with that, I'll move forward. We're also absent Blair Wilcox. So another disclaimer. He was over at the U.S. Army War College. And while there is a specific use case in this presentation about their assessment of some AI tools inside of a war game, I was not there for those. I was not in the room for those sessions. I helped set them up with the company that supported them, but I wasn't in the room for those sessions. So if you have questions on those, just be aware. You've kind of got the B team on that topic as well. So without further ado, I'll move a couple slides forward. So we got a little bit of a roadmap here. Sean and I are going to kind of split this up in half, but I'm going to start with some baselining of some definitions for AI and wargaming. I found it is very good to set like a common vernacular before moving forward. And then Sean is going to walk us through some specific capabilities, risks in a framework for that application. And then I'll come back and we'll kind of drive through a couple case studies that we proposed here. And then hopefully we could have kind of a conversation as we go throughout this as well. So because this was an educational tutorial, we designed some learning objectives, and the whole point of this entire presentation was to kind of see where see if we could identify where Gen AI fits into the life cycle of a war game, and then applying it to the four phases of a war game for design, development, execution, and assessment. And then because understanding what something is also imply requires us understanding the risk to it. So knowing when it's safe to use and when it can be dangerous. So one thing that I like that I for my own self know that I kind of have to set a baseline. So like what is generative AI? This has been probably one of the most interesting topics that I've run into, but because I am not a data scientist, I'm an armor officer and a simulations officer by trade. I don't do software engineering. Again, tanker boots don't have laces for reasons, but um I had to ask, like, what is AI? And so if you kind of think about uh, artificial intelligence is kind of this like a Russian nesting doll. You've kind of got this outer ring, artificial intelligence, where this term was coined back in 1956 at Dartmouth. This is that broad bucket of thinking machines. And so here thinking machines and narrow eye. This even includes something as more recent as like Deep Blue beating Kasparov in 1997. So that's narrow AI. Um, Essentially a glorious calculator that won by brute force logic, calculating millions of chess moves and identifying the best one. So inside that ring, then you've got machine learning. So that's that shift from hard-coded rules to learning from data. So instead of programming a computer to know what the tank looks like, so you feed it thousands of pictures of tanks and let it figure out the patterns itself. And so inside that, you've got deep learning. This is where we get to neural networks. And this is actually one of my favorite stories is you got the story of AlphaGo beating Lee Sedol in 2016. Um, and specifically the move 37 in game two. AlphaGo played a move that shocked everyone watching. And so every expert saw that move and it looked like a mistake. It was so unconventional that honestly a novice might play it by accident, but an expert, a master would never play it on purpose. However, the AI didn't play it by accident. Um, that move threw Lee Sedol off so much that he lost that game as well. Um, but I want to tell the second part of that story, and this is actually why I wanted to spend some time even on this topic of applying generative AI to our challenges, whether wargaming or or just trying to figure out formations like we're trying to do at Features and Concepts Command, because the rest of that story is in game four. Lee Sedol played move 78. I think he was timed thinking about 15, 30 minutes or so on that move. Move 78 was a wedge move so rare that the AI calculated the probability of a human playing it was less than 1 in 10,000. And because AlphaGo dealt in probabilities, it essentially decided that that move would not happen. Lee Sedol paid that move, and afterwards, AlphaGo could not adapt and actually lost that game. It was the only game that was lost there. And so that's part of the reason why we're here. These machines, they're brilliant at patterns, but they can become fragile when facing true human novelty. And so part of the lessons here is that we need the human in the loop to play move 78. And then we'll go down another layer. So at the center, we have generative AI, a specific subset of deep learning. And so here we've moved from machines that simply classify data to machines that use those deep patterns to create new content, such as text, code, imagery. Um, I like to think of this level as like that ultimate staff officer. They've got access to the entire shared drive and they can write that new order for tomorrow's exercise instantly. But at the end of the day, though, it's still a Frankensteining of paragraphs from the last 50 orders it read, everything in there. And one more thing that you don't see here, and this is kind of a testament to how fast things change in this, but inside of that generative AI space, there's another circle, and we can touch on it a little bit, but this is where like those agentic systems live. Whether you're thinking about Claudebot or uh, these are agents that are given actual agency and the ability to act on those decisions that were kind of being drafted, those decisions that have been generated, and then they can then act on them as well. So that's that agentic level, which is kind of inside of that generative AI level. It's more than just an LLM that you converse with, but now you've got agents that you can um, program or direct, and then you will see activity from them as well. And so what I wanted to show here, there's an evolution. You've got calculation to pattern recognition to creation, and now we've got agency as well. So moving little more forward, um, what what opportunities might generative AI bring? And here's kind of a snapshot of what this might look like in practice today. Um, you'll see this loop on a screen. Uh, this isn't just this isn't just a theoretical model. This is a framework for that we're trying to apply to wargaming at Features and Concepts Command, and it kind of hints at the different roles and positions for humans to play, but also AI tools and agents to also play, and different techniques as well. So this loop is a framework where you've got human interaction but also being able to interact with data, um, use your data, your local artifacts to improve your systems, and then continue to engage with things, whether through natural language processing or engaging with say a large language model or an agent for actual actions. A couple things I wanted to highlight here, that was like machine learning models. They're data hungry and perform better the more data they are fed. On the I think this is on the anecdotal side, is what from what we're observing at FCC, is that the data that say informs the actions of these agents um, in in the general environment. That's what gets these that's what gets like Gemini or Copilot or uh, any of these models up to that like high school level, that undergrad level. But you need solid data to get them up to that like expert performance or into trusted agents as well. I think the observation right now is that data, that large, extremely large data set for training, say, intelligent agents or intelligent advisors for, say, military wargaming or professional military wargaming. Um, I haven't seen it yet. Uh, Part of the reason why we wanted to put this out there was because we're trying to create that demand for the data to actually inform agents. Because for the models to perform better, they need data. And what we're seeing is that there's not like a universal data set for wargaming that would allow us um, to train useful agents. All right, we'll keep going forward. And Sean, interrupt me if you see like questions or something in there that we should pause and answer.
Okay, keeping an eye on it, but nothing yet.
Yeah. All right. Next couple slides here. What makes a successful data AI practitioner? So you saw that cycle before, but what does it take to actually do it? And this is kind of a not super scientific way to look at it, but it kind of starts with the fundamentals on the slide, like data awareness and understanding capabilities and limitations, which is part of the reason why we're sharing this stuff today. But thinking about data awareness, that includes just the ability to formulate problems. How do you translate real world problems into tasks that AI can address? In the wargaming space, that means how do you translate real world problems into these games and the rules and play and the rules and the interactions. Well, the next part is translating all that into tasks or words that the AI can address for you. Um, One thing, and this is a personal side, but I kind of go around with the assumption that every generative AI output is effectively a hallucination, but it's up to us as users to kind of assess the usefulness and validity. Um, You have to understand that these models, the outputs of these models are probabilistic. They're guessing the next word. They're not stating facts. They're not stating understanding. So you have to understand that the output is only as good as the data you feed it. And often the output is like the the average of the bell curve, that single point in the middle, the standard deviation in the middle. That is what most of these tools are responding with. And if you take that into account, then you can kind of go back to a very common simulations motto that all models are wrong, but some are useful. So here, the outputs of all these models they're not true. They're not factual until a human um, can apply that level of expertise to them. Another part, say part two for a successful AI practitioner, um, kind of looking at the execution side of AI, and so integration skills and adaptability. Um, One of the most important things is understanding your own workflows. If you don't understand your workflow, you're not going to understand where any new tool fits. So, um, it could be the best capability in the world, but if you don't know what your workflow looks like, you're not going to be able to integrate into there. Um, and then another one is this just like I said earlier, this technology changes by the week. And so you have to be adaptable enough to learn new tools as they arrive, but also uh, curious enough to keep up on what's new and what might be useful. Um, so I think arguably for a successful AI practitioner is you need to be curious. So you have to have that desire to engage with something new. Um, not just sticking to the way we've always done it. Um, that can be a challenge in some bureaucratic agencies like the one I work for. But with curiosity, it helps. And then also, I think we need humility. This is one where you just need self-awareness to admit when you don't know the answer, but also the willingness to learn alongside these machines. Um, if you understand your limitations, and also your strengths, you'll be much more capable moving forward. Also, that's a trait that these systems don't have themselves. So, understanding your own use, and being humble about your own capabilities with these tools, um, will help you be a more effective user of them. So think again, if you don't have curiosity and humility, then I don't think you can be successful. The technology is not going to save you. So, and I think this is probably closer to everyone's wheelhouse in here, but let's look at the other side of this conversation, the wargamer. Um, for this tutorial, we used Peter Perla's framework. And Well, I always found key was like his classic definition. It focuses on decisions made by players, by human players. Um, One comment that he made that I really want to stress was that a war game is an experiment in human interaction, and without players, there may be a model, but there is no game. And that's something I really um, try to keep centered on a lot of my conversations with applying tools like this to wargaming, is that there is a distinction there. We're not trying to use generative AI tools, whatever they are, um, to remove the human from these events. So what makes a war game? It's not just the moving pieces on a map, but you can see it's a system of elements. It starts with the sponsor. So that person, that individual, they own the problem. They define the objectives of that war game. And so without a clear objective, you're just playing a game, but not conducting an actual war game. Then we have the designer. That's the architect. That's their job, is to translate that messy real world problem into a structured environment. That's the person that's building the scenario, defining and refining the rules, understanding physics and friction. That designer is the one who curates the database. For a war game, you've got that's the order of battle, the capabilities that are being represented. And so kind of like we spent some time talking about what an AI practitioner needs and how they have to understand data architectures, that war game designer needs to understand the architecture of conflict. Moving ahead, a couple more, a little deeper dive into the elements of a war game that we were using for our analysis. Like, so once the game starts, it's moving on to execution, and this is where the human element really takes over. You've got the players, blue and red and green, are all trying to interact according to their rules. These are decision engines and decision points. You've got the white cell. These are your referees, adjudicators. We think that this is the place that bears the heaviest cognitive load, as they're representing the world, the rest of the world, calculating combat results, keeping the narrative going. Um, and that this is, and as doing our literature review, for example, this is a place that we often saw as a bottleneck in modern wargaming. And then the analyst. Finally, if we don't capture the data, that game didn't happen. At FCC, the execution of these games is important, but the output of our games, like the future studies program, those are needed by the analysts to conduct analysis and get those insights, extract the insights that answer the sponsor's objectives. Um, we broke it down this way because Sean and I are going to kind of show you which of these roles generative AI tools can augment and which ones it arguably should not replace. Um, and so that's the landscape. We've talked about AI in a very shallow definition, and then a very shallow definition for wargaming. So we've got the people, the rules, we've got friction. Um, but now to kind of talk about how we can plug AI into that process, I'm going to pass it over to Sean Fraser.
And thanks, Rob. Yeah, if you want to hit the next slide, there you go. Hey, so I wanted to talk in here a little bit, kind of breaking down a bit of a framework or a construct for how we can look through this. So I'm going to explore opportunities, risks, and ethics, and discuss a little bit on the capabilities, and then do that at kind of across. It says types. There's really purposes of the war game, and then the phases of the wargaming. And so, uh, really, the four primary purposes there: educational. It's, for us, it's driven by learning objectives. What do I want my students to learn the basics of, or the concept of something. Training, wargaming, driven by training objectives. What do I want my training audience to grow in the capability or capacity to perform? Often that is collectively, although for wargaming, although it's not to say it couldn't be individually. You just generally see it more collectively. And then experimentation analysis. This has kind of been my bread and butter area for quite a while now. That's really driven by like learning to manage or study issues. What do I need to understand more clearly, typically to inform some sort of tangible decision? Usually a money decision, or how do we design a formation, or how many of this new hover tank do I put into a formation, something like that, or how many missiles do we need for a certain conflict. And then, finally, course of action wargaming, which is really driven by the mission. It's optimization, right? How do I best accomplish the mission, right? Plan refinement, plan optimization inherently. Each has a distinct purpose and a distinct risk profile, especially in relation to the employment of generative AI. But really, in any context, the risks are significantly different between them, and you got to kind of treat them accordingly. For this engagement, I'll really orient on the first three up there: educational, training, experimentation, analysis. And I'll leave wargaming be. I do invest some time and energy into that, but just not for the purposes of this. Um, so the utility of generative AI also varies across the phases of wargaming on the bottom side there. So from development to scenario design through execution analysis, some people have different terminology or phases identified, but these are kind of general enough that most people can kind of wrap their brain around them pretty simply. Um, and they align well with other doctrinal frameworks for the Army, like plan, prepare, execute, and assess, right? And so it's an easy translation for us dumb tankers, if you will. Um, so this really helps us explore where we potentially have value, and then where that risk or that caution is warranted. Next slide. So it's definitely not, generative AI isn't just chatbots that we're talking about anymore. I know that's kind of the first iteration, but really it's quite a suite of varied capabilities that really is growing every day, and probably different from the first time I talked about this. But everything from natural language processing to image recognition, retrieval, augmented generation, or RAG, prompt engineering. That's both like, how do I write it, but also do I do system prompts or system instructions behind the scenes that enable me to use a tool differently. But they can support really everything from scenario scripting to dynamic adjudication. But you got to understand or consider things like, the deployment models. Is it cloud versus on-prem, or on-premises local installation, or subscription versus open source? What am I willing to pay for? What's worth paying for? How context windows and potentially fine tuning affect performance. And then all these get a little bit fuzzy when you see the number of different pathways to pursue a large language model, right? So, across the Army, we tend to be a little more constrained depending on what echelon or what security consideration there is for the war game. If it's classified, if it's at the controlled unclassified information level, or if it's just plain unclassified, it kind of changes what capabilities we can use. But with that said, you don't want to get lost in all the capabilities and kind of forget the outcome, right? So whether you choose Camo GPT or Ask Sage or Meta or Google or OpenAI or Grok, there's a lot of options out there, but it's more about how you plan and how you understand the risk and capabilities than it is about the individual tool. Um, So, a couple other examples on here, just like kind of quick thought examples, but we'll dive into some of these. You can use, retrieval augmented generation to upload large amounts of reference material, right? That may be a driver for which model you use and how you think about the kind of the model or the employment model, deployment model that you're thinking of. With some models, you can do kind of some simple back end prompt engineering or system instructions, if you will, or have temperament controls that improve the reliability of an output for participants. So, think of, for those not familiar, temperament controls usually represented in a sliding scale between, complete factual accuracy, like don't tell me anything except what is explicitly in the references you have, to sliding scale to be, uber creative, and just go wild with, whatever you want to bring your most dangerous ideas. And then finally, kind of the plain old chat portion that you can do is a great way to iterate back and forth with ideas. It's like Rob talked about, having the young lieutenant there, or a staff officer that you can kind of go to and provide some basic instructions. You're not going to get a perfect product back because that individual is probably still in their early stages of their career and development. But you can iterate on that with them and it gets development for them. So next time you ask, hopefully it's a better expectation. That can be true with AI, depending on how you use it, how you treat it. But also, it's certainly true with people, but also through that iteration, you can refine a product using less of your time and more of that younger staff officer's time. Uh, so you can do that with generative AI to a certain level. Next slide. So risks and ethics. This is kind of the flip side of what we just talked about. Not all the capabilities, but it definitely introduced some additional risks in the form of particularly bias, hallucinations, as Rob talked about, overtrust, data leakage, depending on what you're trying to do. You may be concerned about that information getting spilled out. They're not just technical concerns; they can be, particularly for the Army, operational problems as well, if not mitigated. So imagine a war game where generative AI misrepresents adversary intent or fabricates a terrain feature, while human operators are placing maybe too much trust in the system. So overtrust could have a dramatic impact on the outcome of a war game. Um, and some models have been biased in how they've been developed or what training data was provided. So overtrust could yield issues there. And then trust is a concern both ways, right? Too much trust is overconfidence in the outputs, but too little trust can result in a lack of engagement and then poor usage habits, which also creates a problem for successful employment inside of a war game, I believe. There's a fair amount of naysayers out there who are like utterly unwilling to unlock additional productivity with generative AI because they see it as kind of an all or nothing solution versus an iterative solution. How do I use it to reduce my workload? Not, I just hit one button and all of a sudden it perfectly knows everything I wanted it to do and gets it right every time. Um, we've definitely got to treat outputs, generative AI outputs, as advisory and not authoritative, and then build safeguards into our workflows. And then data protection, we talked about that, but it's a major concern for Department of War, defense industry, war gamers, et cetera. This goes back to your capability assessment, right? When you think about, well, how do I, do I have on-prem versus a cloud solution, an open source versus a subscription? That'll impact your, kind of your data protection in there. But you should definitely assess and mitigate those risks early on in what you're doing. Next slide. All right, so we talked about the risk. You got to mitigate those now. So how do we do that? I think it's first of all, it's start with simplicity, right? Use generative AI for low risk tasks first, like generating reference material, or brainstorming injects, agendas, or concepts. It's an advisory, not authoritative, kind of an iterative process with it. The first use should probably not be replacing any participant of a war game, just augmenting their capability and or capacity to do something, and then slowly kind of layer in validation and play testing expert oversight to verify results coming out of that generative AI. Another good mitigation practice is in fine tuning to a specific area or topic that can reduce the likelihood of poor model outputs, but can also increase the risk of simply repeating the same ideas, right? There's different types of wargamings, and you got to think about your purpose of that in anything that you do, because if I really want novel ideas, or I want ideas that are outside the typical sphere in which I'm operating, or the typical answer from the types of people that I have for my wargaming, if I'm looking for creative ideas that bring in thoughts from other industries or whatever else, then I may want to be cautious in that, in what I choose, and what resources I give it. And then broad use by a variety of wargame participants can also help reduce some drifting in the understanding. So, like, the more engagement you have across a number of, maybe it's different tools, or maybe it's different portions of a tool, can certainly reduce the risk you have of just one same chat getting used over and over again, and then you get a reduced return on your answers. And then, I am a simulations officer. We hold near and dear the process of verification, validation, and accreditation, VVNA for short. So we've got to evolve that, I think, to include AI generated content. There's some good teams, like industry teams like Scale AI or others, that do some sort of test and evaluation or benchmarking of large language models for use in a variety of topical areas, and then they assess the reliability of answers in those topical areas. Those are of high interest and good tools to use if you can find one. I think CDAO is also working on one, but and then, when you're thinking about the mitigations, remember, it's mitigating risk. It's not eliminating risk, right? Sometimes in our hubris, we forget to consider the level of expertise and reliability of the average human participant in wargaming. When we start to critique what outputs we get from generative AI, you certainly can't expect perfection, and you won't get that from people, and you're not going to get it from AI either. But when you think about, how do I use this to make it better, I think there's plenty of opportunities in there. And then, particularly in experimentation and analysis wargaming, I talked about kind of the VVNA, verification, validation, accreditation. A level of accreditation over the whole event is definitely prudent to ensure that an event is on track to inform, the decisions that it is designed to inform, right? So when you think about experimentation analysis, again, focus on decision support somewhere. Let's go ahead. Next slide. All right, so jumping into kind of the phases of wargaming, what are the types of things that AI can help with? You know, so we'll just walk through it here. So let's start in wargame development. Generative AI can certainly assist with development of ideas, rule books, references, kind of the where do I start sort of things. In scenario design, it could generate images and the terrain features or injects. During execution, it might support facilitation or act as a cognitive advisor. And then in analysis, it can help consolidation of notes or summarize gameplay, etc. But in every phase, risk tolerance should guide your usage, right? So as you look across those things, educational games, as you see kind of on the left-hand side there, are inherently low risk. The worst outcome is typically a lesser educational experience through the war game that can be corrected, by through either more education, future training, future leadership, or a diligent professor. Kind of the next one down, training has a little bit more of a medium risk. You don't want to build bad habits in training due to poor AI outputs, because while there's still time to overcome it, you don't want those habits to take over. Training is about building good habits. But wargaming is one portion of training. There's still rehearsals, there's live training, there's constructive simulations, there's good quality leadership that can really help overcome a few bad outputs during a war game. And then for, again, talking experimentation analysis is definitely the higher risk category. Poor war game outputs or outcomes can lead to poor decisions on future capabilities, concepts, force designs that impact kind of our future war winning readiness. And then that's obviously a detriment to us, right? For the wargaming phase, I probably use generative AI to support the development and review of rule books initially, references, encounters. I may use it to help perform kind of initial research or scope the war game. I may use a large language model assistance in the validation of ideas or thoughts, like, "Hey, red team me, help me improve my thinking." For people who are really getting into it, may be suitable to employ a large language model to help develop the requirements for and or the code base of a digital war tool for wargaming, right? Um, and then it's just in the validation of that, even like play testing, if you will, against maybe a generative AI. That seems like an interesting use case to me, though I have not explicitly done it. So, and then in scenario developments, all war games need some sort of scenario. Doesn't always have to be extravagant, but it is a foundational component. So I may use generative AI to help source or generate maps. At the Artificial Intelligence Integration Center, one of our AI scholars explored tools that support the generation of a road to war, which is kind of the path of how he went from the along the conflict continuum from through crisis into conflict, and then associated relevant products. We have a bunch of acronyms for it. I think they're covered up there, but PMISI, PT, ASCOPE, they're just mnemonics for how you walk through assessing different areas. Weather data. Could do a number of that, even through back end prompting of saying, "Hey, here's the format I want you to give me stuff back in, so it's a reliable place." I may also use it to generate additional surrounding context for realism inside scenarios. So this adds kind of a level of complexity of information that players may have to sift through to get to what's important, which often is a useful training objective or learning objective, right? Causing people to, have to prioritize in what they're doing because there is a lot coming at them. Um, and as is in the case of any phase in here, you can always just use it for that simple chat feature. Help yourself think a little bit deeper as you're walking through that. Um, so into execution, I might get pretty daring and use a large language model as a facilitator or to support a human facilitator with, maybe a workspace where I've ragged in references to the rule book and the scenario and some other things that they can, use to generate maybe some prompts or things real quick. I also probably want to have a set of doctrinal references available, and I'd probably rag those in again for participant references needed, so they have some sort of doctrinal tool they can go to. And we actually did this when I was down in Arizona a couple of weeks ago. I may want to do the same for a threat reference, particularly if I'm facing an adversary that is not well known to participants, right? And then I can upload, ATPs or technical publications or threat assessments, or it may have direct access to threat data through a variety of different systems. So usually that drops it or raises the classification level. I could use it to develop injects that players need to respond to. This adds some realism and could be kind of contextualized by generative AI if you use RAG to kind of provide it the appropriate scenario war game products and inputs. So it kind of understands a little bit of the context. And then setting conditions for the use of generative AI in this manner during kind of war game development is really critical to effective employment, right? You can't decide I'm going to use Gen AI last minute and kind of during the execution phase to kind of throw it in there. That isn't going to be setting conditions for a good war game. So plan it out with the rest of your war game as you start your development, stereo development, and execution. Plan all that out ahead of time. Don't think of it as an easy button that requires no effort. It just changes maybe how you do some of your work as you lead up. Maybe makes you a little bit faster and more efficient. Um, But if you think of it like an easy button and that requires no effort, it will probably fail you. And then lastly, there, analysis and AR, you know, during this phase, I'd say employ LLMs to support data analysis of both structured and unstructured data. I'd use it to help me with formatting and organizing information, generating reports, consolidating daily notes into a document. This is an area that I believe is particularly underexplored right now, although I'd say even over the past little bit, we've gotten much better at it. I've seen good examples of it and some promising developments across the community. But if I have terabytes of data that nobody ever references, that's probably far worse than an occasional hallucination from an LLM that enables me to actually use that data, right? So if I connect my model to read that data directly from the game and enable it to see the game board as well, I may also significantly increase what I'm able to use it for, especially kind of in that final phase of helping with analysis or AR, generation of insights coming out of it. Next slide, please. All right, so this is kind of the help yourself think slide. I kind of talked about it a little bit, so I'll kind of speed a little bit through this slide, but it can help, structure, speed up, and/or deepen your thinking. Again, you see some of the other mnemonics on there that I talked about. So dime fill, PMISI PT, MET-TC, or ASCOPE, they're all listed on there, but they're just a way for us to think about the entire environment, right? The entire operational environment of what's going on. And you could apply this to other types of wargaming as well with some of those same mnemonics, because frankly, they are not just about the military side, and that's the point of them. Generative AI can definitely generate reasonable scenario context, inject civilian or infrastructure profiles, and/or terrain and infrastructure features aligned with these mnemonics. Again, it's a tool; it's not a replacement for expertise, but the average tool is probably going to be better than the average person in creating a reasonable ASCOPE or PMISI PT assessment of somewhere, right? So if I were to provide my own assessment of Pittsburgh, I guarantee you AI searching the web probably does a much better job than I would. And so if you think about it that way, again, you go back to, well, it's probably better than the average human. And then, there's all the scenario elements, right? So the mission types, force posture, the terrain that you're on, the civilian considerations that are going on. It could be cyber threats or what's going on in an urban environment, or even population attitudes, religious context for an area. You're probably going to get better responses out of there than you are from your average person who's not an expert in that field. So all of these can help feed into the realism surrounding a scenario in particular. Grounding it in reality is often where you have RAG as an important tool set. So you may say, hey, I only want you to reference, the CIA World Factbook, because that's, my trusted source on what's going on in X or Y country. And then, all right, so yeah, we talk weather infrastructure, kind of time frames. It can pretty rapidly generate plausible conditions. Plausibility does not, carry over into accuracy or relevancy to objectives necessarily. So human validation is really essential in those areas in particular. Is this really relevant to the objectives? Or is this steering me away from my core objectives? Again, bouncing back to your purpose for doing the war game in the first place. Employing these models to generate synthetic information on relevant to a particular area time frame will definitely drastically reduce the time needed to develop the scenario products. There's a lot of time spent on development of scenarios, particularly in Army wargaming. So if you let it do a bunch of the gathering of information and then focus your mind a little bit more on the critical decisions and maybe the more nuanced aspects of war game enabling, objective targeting, etc. And then, we talked about RAG, prompt engineering, and iterative chat can definitely significantly speed up scenario development process and improve the depth of your final scenario products. And then don't forget, again, I had this a couple times, but don't forget to link it back to your overarching objectives, right? The war game was designed to achieve objectives, not typically designed to use technology. Um, Objectives must always remain paramount. When possible, if you can feed the objectives to the large language model as context for when you're doing scenario development, other things, uh, that's the best, because anything you hold back from the large language model and then you expect it to kind of orient on those things and know what you're talking about, that's where you have some problems. So usually the more more detailed you are in engagement with it, the better output you get from it normally. Next slide, please. All right, so opportunities is kind of a framework for educational assessment. So again, we talked about a little bit about this, so I'll go kind of somewhat quick, but for educational games, where I'd focus on is, certainly support to facilitator roles. Scenario development is much easier when you're in the educational side, because if you feed it again those objectives, you can really target it pretty easily, and keep your risk low. And then certainly post game analysis of like what actually happened, maybe assessment metric development, as we see on there. What is it? How can we help with that? The risk is low. The mitigation is pretty straightforward, right? Use your instructors to validate the outputs. They should be more than able to do that. If nothing else, it promotes a really healthy discussion, which is almost always enhances learning, right? This is where generative AI really shines, right? Enhance learning without compromising integrity. You go wild, in my opinion, go wild in educational wargaming with large language models. Use it to kind of shape objectives, draft rule books, reg in references, develop a road to war, scenario products, get advanced and let it help you facilitate the game, or use it to develop a learning assessment rubric, metrics rubric. Allow it to see the game and get feedback from it. Usually the classification is very high on educational war games. The risk is truly low, in my opinion, here. So this is the best place to explore new methods of use, up to and including even potentially using a model as an agent or a player within the game, to understand what a different look at it. And you can even give it different personas to do so. Next slide, please. All right, so this is kind of the training assessment framework. Again, a little bit more constrained here. I'd support inject generation, the consolidation of information for daily hot washes. Definitely scenario enhancement and context, though I wouldn't have it outright generate everything without kind of some clear, boundaries or inputs. The risk is definitely moderate. Again, we talked about bad habits, in training, bad habits in execution. We people, much like AI, quickly fall back to what we have been trained on, right? Especially in high stress situations. So when you're training for, combat or conflict, you want to be able to lean back on the training that you received. This is definitely where, experienced leaders and clear training objective focus, as well as deliberate planning, are necessary to help mitigate some of the risk. I would definitely consider use of generative AI to accelerate your kind of planning and recap. But I would keep adjudication and generally like the movement of systems human-led for now, unless you do like a true full-blown integration and have the time to kind of do a full-blown validation before that. But I think a good hybrid model is key. How do I maximize human focus on the most important factors that I want them to learn about or reinforce through the employment of AI assistance in the development of time-consuming products. So my AI could be a stand-in for some other element of the staff that's not there. But I believe access to the game data and image recognition of what is occurring definitely could enable his quality insights or that type of functionality. But again, subject matter expert validation of outputs is wise, but maybe not essential in every little aspect, but definitely critical in a lot. Next slide, please. And I think this is the last one of mine. So experimentation and analysis. Again, this has been my bread and butter for a little while now. Here, the risk is definitely a little bit higher, so I'd use it primarily for advisory and/or data processing or visualization roles. It can definitely assist with data analysis, structured and unstructured. It could assist with expanding scenario realism, but you have to be very careful because usually there's conditions on what scenarios are used. And then DCMP or data collection management plan. So, how am I collecting data to inform whatever decision I ultimately want to use? Helping develop that DCMP would be a good tool or a good use of, I think, of Gen AI. But again, only if it is contextualized by the kind of learning demands or study objectives you have. Definitely use it to help you think through the problems more deeply on the front end, but I'd use caution in the outputs during execution and analysis. Depending on what your decision is informing, maybe it's okay for like adjacent insights, but not on the core insights. But certainly, either way, have a process to validate them. Outputs need to be validated, traceable, and documented. I think is kind of a good good thing to lean on in this environment. And that's where Gen AI potentially meets some of its more defined limits, is how you do that. So I'll kind of close this slide with a personal example of how I use this on a couple of occasions. But so during one Army experiment, I used a particular model to sort through what was really thousands of observations that were flowing in from all over a division level exercise. And this would have been really impossible within the given time frame otherwise. So this allowed me to kind of focus my time on the most important ones and spend a whole lot less time weeding through less mature um, uh, insights or observations. Could it have missed some? Yes, right. But I certainly would have missed a ton more observations if I had just gone, kind of chronologically and walked through them if I hadn't used it because of the time constraints I had. So I was forced to provide. I did force the AI to provide particular specific links to the exact locations in the data repository where it was referencing unstructured data. So I could always go in, click in, validate what some human wrote somewhere. And that changed my work drastically and created a level of efficiency that certainly was unachievable without it. I was able to extract mature evidence based insights using qualitative outputs or unstructured data, if you will, in a fraction of the time it would have normally taken me. So I was able to meet time demands on that. But key to remember is that I'm still responsible, right? For every word that I wrote for each insight, I'm still responsible for it, right? AI was a tool to help improve my efficiency and accuracy. But in the end, when somebody turns around and says, hey, what's this insight about? I own that answer. But I'll leave it there. And I think back over to Rob. And I'll start looking through the questions, see if there was anything I missed.
All right, thanks, Sean. To kind of to me push a couple slides forward, and I want to try to hit the bottom line with these two hot topics here. So, first one, again, this was an integration at the Army War College. Colonel Wilcox was the lead for this one, and I helped bring an AI tool set into the room. And then we'll kind of talk really quick about integration of trying to generate generative AI into our future force studies at FCC. I'm going to try to move to the bottom line here so that we don't take too much of people's time. So if you look at the Army War College was doing a war game May 2025 with Army North. Um, and what they were kind of looking for, well, basically, they had a staff section operate inside of this war game, and they just brought an AI tool into that room as like another member of the S3 shop. Um, and so they were really looking at generative AI in the scenario development and then the execution phase in this iteration, while they were hopefully looking at future runs to see how war game development or analysis could be supported by these tools. So their focus here again was on development and then execution. One kind of one of their two of their main insights on the development side was that it was really good at translating piles of data into useful narratives. It was also very good at in the execution side, making exposing the reasons for decisions getting made. That ability to like very quickly create documents that can support the storyline for players, keep them engaged, um, was a very strong uh, way for an AI tool inside of the scenario being developed. Um, Inside of execution, the training required bullet there, that's actually talking about the staff, the human beings on that staff. Um, Dumping a tool onto a staff that they have no training on, whether it's an AI tool or the next version of a FATADS, which is a targeting system, or just, some quantum computer. It's not going to matter how great that system or capability might be. It's going to be limited by the training that the staff has on it. So training is required. You can't just dump something onto a staff and hope that it's going to go well. Um, Alternative features and post-game analysis. I want to hit those two first because the course of action collapse one is something that I think is important to really bring up here. Um, that ability to like pivot from data to the story documents or the storyline allowed them to kind of war game alternative futures inside their war game. If we made this choice, what might happen? And then have a kind of have a conversation that can be informed by subject matter experts. So they could actually go through and explore very quickly alternative futures. And then in their limited analysis on execution, again, the ability to just like go back and pull out insights from the entire conversation. The AI that the computer wasn't getting tired. 3 days, 4 days of mental wargaming is going to be exhausting, especially in like this professional military educational point. The AI never got tired. It had no problem reaching back 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, and pulling some of that information forward to help do analysis. Um, and this last one I want to hit is something on course of action collapse, and this is one of Colonel Wilcox's main arguments from their experience, is that these tools inside of a war game, and actually we kind of argue inside of a lot of military planning processes, um, are not the best way. The best way to employ them is not on the course of action generation side, but on the course of action, we want to use the word collapse side. Humans generate the initial courses of action, allow the AI to kind of help reveal gaps in there, what got missed, whether the sustainment plan for this operation is missing because we've spent so much time working on the operational plan. Course of action collapse allows the narrowing of all of our options, not the it's just not the expansion. And part of the reason for that, again, goes back to the nature of many of these tools and how they generate outputs. And so if you're using it for course of action generation, the give me ideas to solve this problem, what you're going to end up with is, again, basically the average and the aggregate. That is the solution that you're getting. If you use it in the other way to build out or find gaps or have them red team your plans, that allows you to apply rigor to your course of action that you've already generated. It makes them stronger and narrows that area of possibility. So that's one of their lessons learned on where AI tools in planning and execution, especially on these operations, is a more appropriate place. We move a couple slides forward. So here, this is some of the observations. Again, you can't just unleash these tools on a headquarters without training. It's not useful. You're limiting the capability and because of the staff's limitations. It's not the systems, it's the staff. Integration, course of action collapse, not course of action development. Think about which side of the tree or decision tree you're kind of looking at with the course of action. Making your courses of action better, narrowing them into more realistic considerations that you may have missed because of the planning process. That's course of action collapse versus course of action development. So you think about the like the Minotaur and the Centaur. the centaur. So where are you going to put the AI? If the machine is leading the way, that's the Minotaur. If the human is leading the way, that's the centaur. So that's that argument there. Lead the way with the human, allow these tools to, like in the planning process, help you with course of action collapse. We talked about alternative futures, and then post-game analysis showing potential. So they were going to kind of move forward because there were some requirements that they needed, uh, improving memory, context, things like that, actually getting handled just by time and integrations versus anything like specifically being done at most of our military organizations. All right. And then real quick, kind of looking at here at the Features and Concepts command, like where might Gen AI play a role? And I think this, what I want to kind of describe is like an intelligent agent and advisor. So if you're trying to put all the pieces of a war game together, and for our military war games, we have a foundation in doctrine and feature concepts. On top of that, you're building this war game um, with performance, hopefully prior performance, that history, as well as lessons learned. How do you bring them in? And then you describe the operational environment that is specific to that war game. And all that comes together and creates that like that capstone war game scenario. Um, there is a lot of data in that pyramid that has to get processed. Just like a very simple example, there's something called a master scenario event list for many simulation supported command post exercises. It's just a list of events and injects and how they are put into an exercise. And most of the time, they're a rehash of last year's. You may you may replace Alaska with Hawaii or Taiwan with Korea and then press send. Well, something as simple as like an AI generator can allow you to bring up the like to create those emails from the G3 to the J3 that asks about the air ground integration considerations with, say, Japan, Australia, and Korea, and then they'll get a report. That report probably has topics in there like what to do about F-35s and how to worry about the THAAD. Well, very quickly you could then say, okay, tell me about, hey, G3 to J3 again. Um, I could ask an AI to adapt that prompt message to be, okay, I want to know about the air ground integration coordination concerns with the Philippines and say Taiwan or Vietnam. And because we've given that tool access to lessons learned, doctrine, feature concepts in an updated operation environment, in 2, maybe 5 seconds, because I'll have to make sure that I didn't misspell the person's name that the email will eventually get to. I can create that email, and that will talk about um, Patriot batteries and Stingers and the roles of infantry brigade combat teams, because those are more appropriate for those environments, whereas the high level, high techs were more appropriate for those others. That is an ability that you can just bounce very quickly, and so you're keeping that relevance and realism much more you've made that realism much more attainable and just potentially just buying 5 minutes for those planners so they could do different work. They can focus on the actual decisions that are getting made versus pumping out the emails that have to get sent out during an exercise. Again, you think about foundations. You've got concepts. You leverage RAG to extract what's important from those documents. And then performance, history, and lessons learned. This is kind of one of those like a lesson observed is many times today, a lesson observed is not a lesson learned. But also at the same time, if a unit did something really well in the last exercise, they probably don't have to do it again. So um, we could adjust our new learning demands based on the observer control report, which you kind of see here as an example. Then you've got to bring it all together. Piles of data, machines are great at dealing with it. It's too much for an individual to do. So, but you can't just, again, you have to put a person in the loop, because that trust that these things can go straight to a decision maker is kind of limited. So you've still got to keep those subject matter experts in between. And then you think about the elements of the war game. Now you've been able to take the objectives, scenario, the database, the models, the rules, the players, all of that you've able to use generative AI tools to kind of put them all together. Couple questions, and this is kind of for everyone to just kind of take away is like, um, for us, like key questions on the application of Gen AI is like, how do we integrate generative AI within data modernization processes? How can RAG be integrated with secure and authorized data sets? Sustains and improves again that lessons learned versus lessons observed question. A little less required, I think, today, but informed prompt engineering. I mean, that's probably replaceable now by the training your people on how to use the tools that are available to them so they get the most out of it. And that's kind of where we're looking at applying some of this stuff at the Future Studies program, our futures concept experiments, experiments at our battle labs. We do an annual exercise called Project Convergence Capstone um, out at Fort Irwin every year, and you'll see AI from managing drone swarms to writing scenario information. So there's a lot of places for where we are trying to look at applying these systems into our processes, but trying to do it in a responsible way. And so this is kind of the wrap up slide here. Um, we talked about what Gen AI is, what wargaming was, so we can kind of frame the conversation. Um, we kind of got this question about should we integrate Gen AI to wargaming? If yes, where? If not, why not? I think the answer to honestly that question is even if you say we should not integrate Gen AI into wargaming overall, you are probably arguing too far back. So this is just this kind of like in academics with like or just in your neighborhood life these tools are out there but we have to be aware of the kind of the right way to integrate them and so that's very important. Gen AI is not a replacement for expertise. It makes experts better at what they do but it makes Luddites worse while giving them a false sense of capability. However, it does allow, it can improve people's learning and intake of these things in order to make them better, um, better understanding, get them closer to the expert level. Uh, Gen AI tools can definitely make wargamers more efficient, and more effective with the right implementation. And again, kind of that bottom line message, baseline knowledge on generative AI improves results. One of the reasons why we put this tutorial together and wanted to share it with today is that we're not trying to pitch any specific model or company um, or capability to you guys, to the community. We kind of saw that is what is if you've ever been to a conference called ITSIC, this is where we presented this thing. There are hundreds of organizations out there pitching their product as the solution to every single one of your problems. Um, the goal of a like a session like this was to kind of put it out there. If you can solve problems with something that's generally available, if you could solve most of your problems, maybe you handle all the low-hanging fruit. Or even better, you're just better informed about how these tools work. And that allows you to have better questions so that when you do engage with a proprietary capability that you have a better conversation with them. You don't have to waste time on the basics. You could take your real problems or your real workflows and then have a conversation which gets to those um, instead of say signing up for something that you did not need because you don't understand how the systems work or you bought into the maybe not snake oil, but um, you bought into the pamphlet and instead of carrying your challenges into those conversations. So that was kind of what here is like, let's learn a little bit about what these things can do on the general side so that we can have better conversations when you need to put these things together. So with that, uh, Sean, you have any last comments? And then maybe we could pass it over to see if there's any more questions in the chat that we could try to answer.
No, happy to take any questions if there was anything else, but no other comments other than thanks for your time, and certainly appreciate you letting us talk at you for a little bit.
There is also some questions that have been put under the Q&A function. I'll read them out just so maybe they can be recorded for the YouTube channel later. We have Adil Khan who asks, you mean it makes Luddites worse because AI is a mirror? I think just a little bit of clarification on what you meant by makes Luddites worse.
I'd have to go back and specifically, but there was a pretty interesting Microsoft article on AI integration less than a year ago. But it was generally like, uh, oh man, I'm just blanking on the curve. But it goes back to the more you know about something, there's this valley where you, you your understanding and your understanding of what you don't know kind of collide. And if you're using AI, just like many tools, it in a very simple way or without kind of understanding how the responses of a system are aggregates and averages, and this, then you're going to run into, um, say, you can build these conversations into echo chambers, and that would only reinforce, that would only reinforce prior, say, lack of knowledge, because these systems are not trying to generate, they're not trying to answer the facts, they're trying to answer questions in a way that you'll give it a thumbs up.
And if there are no more questions in the chat for our presenters, I will just take this opportunity to thank you all for your time and thank you all for coming and attending. And with that, I'll